Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to open the second day of this conference with a session on educating mandates, French, British, and German perspectives. The taxi driver who took me here noted that this is an exciting day to be in Jerusalem. I couldn't agree more, and I can assure you that we shall have our share of excitement, even though of a different kind. We deal with education, which is a tool whose impact develops slowly and over time. And perhaps this is why most historians tend to give it less attention than they do to other human enterprises which have a more immediate impact, such as politics. In our context here, education was an instrument in the hands of ruling powers who tried to mold through this socio-cultural and political realities in the countries, in the societies in which they ruled. First of all, to suit their interests, and then the second priority to fulfill the role for which they were appointed here, to prepare those societies into life in the modern world. It was also an instrument in the hands of local leaderships to advance objectives that they consider more appropriate. Now, governments had more potent powers at their disposal. They dictated curricula, they controlled textbooks, they oversaw the management of administration of teaching and learning, they budgeted or avoided budgeting the establishment of institutions of learning, they ran training teachers, and so on and so forth. The local forces had less potent and more limited powers at their disposal. But they did have agency in different ways, and perhaps one of the most important one was that they were the men on the spot. And I think this choice of gender is proper. They were the men on the spot in the sense that they were the teachers in the classroom who could impart ideas and principles that they saw fit and which challenged the policies of the government. To discuss these issues and related issues, we have three speakers today, and I'll introduce them one at a time. Each will speak for about 25 minutes, and we start with Professor Esther Möller, who is currently a senior researcher at the Institute of European History in Mainz, and who is about to join the Franco-German Research Center, Center Margalit in Berlin, as its German vice director. During the academic year 22-23, Esther was the Alfred Grosser Visiting Chair at Sciences Po in Paris. From 2020 to 2022, she was a visiting professor of cultural history of North Africa at the Universität der Bundeswehr in Munich. And after she completed a PhD thesis on the French schools in Mandate, Lebanon in early 20th century, she was a research associate at the Leibniz Institute of European History in Mainz, where she recently completed her habilitation thesis on the history of humanitarianism aid in the Middle East during the second half of the 20th century. Her research interests include modern Middle Eastern and European history with a focus on education, humanitarianism, and colonialism. I'll mention a couple of her most recent publications. There are more. One of them, together with Katharina Stonig and Johannes Paulmann, it's an edited volume, Gendering Global Humanitarianism in the 20th Century, Practice, Politics, and the Power of Representation, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. and together with Zachary Chitwood, also edited Foundations and Power of Giving, Christian, Islamic, and Jewish Perspectives, published at Endowment Studies in 2020. Esther will address us on comparing systems, Lebanese perspectives on French, British, and German educational institutions in the mandate period. 25 minutes. Esther, please.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for the organizers of this conference, Billie Melman and Liat Kozma, for their invitation. Thank you also to Sima for answering all the questions of logistical order I had in advance. And I'm very happy to return for the occasion to return to the sources of my PhD thesis, as you mentioned, on French schools in Lebanon. I will start directly. In 1912, an anonymous female author under the pseudonym of Salwa published an article in the Beiruti newspaper Al-Barq. She criticized the city's inhabitants for their unreflected preference of any foreign school to Beirut's own educational institutions. Indeed, since the late 19th century, a growing number of foreign schools had been established in the Ottoman Vilayet of Beirut, most of them run by Christian missionaries of French, American, British, German, and even other origin, but also by some secular and Jewish associations. Most of these schools had much more financial and logistical opportunities than the state-run schools, and most often also than the private institutions set up by Lebanese of different religious backgrounds. All these schools were often in harsh competition with each other for pupils, but also for governmental support, a situation that wouldn't change with the establishment of the French Mandate. In this paper, I would like to explore the multiple dimensions and meanings of comparing educational systems in Mandate Lebanon. I argue that first, comparing was a fundamental method and way of thinking at all levels of governments, from the mandate authorities to the schools and their representatives, to teachers, students, their parents, and public figures. Indeed, intellectuals at that time were fascinated by comparisons in Europe as well as in the Middle East, and I'm sure we will hear more about it in the next two presentations. The Lebanese historian and Arab nationalist Mohammed Jamil Beyhoum, for example, wrote his PhD thesis in Paris in 1928 about the mandates in Syria and Iraq. And the comparison of the different mandates has been prominent among historians until today, although we seek to free it from any underlying idea of modernization theory. I guess you have already mentioned these books yesterday, and the last one is one I edited with two colleagues about schools in Syria and Lebanon and the entanglement between them. I thus want to warn you and myself from a possible bias in the analysis, in my analysis of comparing systems. Although all the levels of comparisons that I mentioned, all the different levels of governance are very fruitful, in this contribution I will privilege a bottom-up approach and thus focus on the pupils, parents, and teachers who reacted to the educational system of Mandate Lebanon, but also, as my second argument goes, influenced it. You mentioned the agency of the people on the ground, and by knowing about the mandate's authorities and French governors' fear of losing any influence towards the German, British, American, or Italian educational institutions, Lebanese students, parents, and teachers were able to impose certain ideas and measures in the French schools. In order to reflect on these different power relations within the practice of comparison, the ideas of the French philosopher Michel de Certeau seem to be helpful to me. He speaks about strategies and tactics. Maybe you know these ideas. So the strategies of those who have the power in a certain field and who can decide on different strategies, and tactics of those who have less power but still the possibility and also the opportunity and agency to act and negotiate within these fields. In the next 20 minutes, I will thus take a closer look at the negotiations between these different actors throughout the mandate period by analyzing first the necessity of the Lebanese to adapt to the new French system in the early 1920s. Second, their criticism of the system by referring to the British mandate in the Middle East. And finally, from the 1930s onwards, the growing attraction of non-French schools as a symbol for the claim for independence. So starting with the first part, the necessary adaptation to the new French educational system. When the mandates were set up in the Middle East, Lebanon was the smallest one in geographical size, and it is nearly impossible to detach it from the developments in Syria, yet it differed from the latter because of its relatively large group of pro-mandate inhabitants. Contrary to the other mandates of Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan, Catholic Lebanese, in particular Maronites, supported the French mandate as a guarantee for their own economic and social superiority in the new Lebanese state. At the end of World War I, the educational landscape in Syria was not only very diverse, but educational opportunities were also very unequally distributed. The majority of the population remained illiterate, although the absolute number of enrolled pupils tripled from 1923 to 1945. After World War I, all Ottoman state schools were closed down, and instead the mandate authorities opened public schools, but only for the primary level, and with much less financial and logistical support than those of the French schools. Most schools were in the bigger cities or in the former area of Mount Lebanon, which you can see on the map, and mandate efforts remained focused, as I said, on the primary level, while secondary and even more university education was mainly left to private institutions, and thus to a very limited group of wealthy families who could afford to pay the school fees. While social background counted a lot and led to the perpetuation of an unequal distribution of educational opportunities, the French mandate offered limited opportunities also to parts of the lower middle classes who were able to receive scholarships and reach secondary and even higher education. So approximately 400 schools of French schools offered their education in the mandate period, which is quite an important number for this small country. Most of them were run by French Catholic missionaries, but also by the French Catholic secular association Mission Laïque Française, a French Protestant college, and also the French Jewish association Alliance Israélite Universelle, though the latter mainly concentrated on the primary level. Next to American and British Protestant missionaries who were allowed to run these schools, but under a strict control. The only schools that were not allowed to open again were the German ones, as they had quite a success among Lebanese families, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish alike, who regretted them now. The French schools very openly expressed their satisfaction of having been able to replace these German schools. The Lebanese thus had to adapt to the new educational system, and how did they do that? I would like to go back to the example of Salwa, this anonymous author whom I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. She was no one else than the writer, teacher, and feminist activist Salma Sayer. And Salma Sayer, during the mandate, taught Arabic at the French secular school Mission Laïque Française, and she was also the first Lebanese inspector of the newly founded Ministry of Public Instruction in 1928. Sayer, who was fluent in Arabic, French, and English, thus, on the one hand, as we have seen, adapted a critical attitude towards foreign educational institutions, but she also taught at them and probably also used her position there to spread her convictions of Arab and Lebanese nationalism and female empowerment to her students. Lebanese parents had to adapt to the new system as well. Some were happy to do so because, as I mentioned, they shared the idea of a French civilizing mission in Lebanon. This was especially the case of the Maronites. And if you look at pictures like this, Vive la France, obvious pictures which praise the French system, although, as you can imagine, we have to have a much more critical look at these pictures, and in fact it was also a way of seeking funds from France. But nonetheless, there were a number of families sharing these convictions. Others sent their children to the French schools, although they did not agree with the ideological background, but because, as some parents declared it in letters to the schools, these schools offered the best knowledge of French and also all the skills their children had to know for succeeding in the new mandate system. Still others continued to enroll their children in other institutions with a more nationalist position. This was, for example, the case of a national school, Madrasa al-Ahliya, run by Marie Kassab, who herself had been a student of the Protestant mission, British Protestant missions, and her school was attended mainly by children of Muslim Sunni and Greek Orthodox families who were much more critical of the French mandate. And this is also why this school was strictly controlled by French mandate services. And here the notion of comparison played a very important role, both by those who controlled and those who replied to the questions. In a report from 1925, for example, Marie Kassab, who run the school, complained about a French teacher she had in her school as being too old and using too old French methods, while Mrs. Lay, this French teacher, in turn complained about Kassab, declaring that, I quote, "Everywhere you feel the British influence." So you can see that both also played with this Franco-British competition in the Levant and especially in Lebanon, and this French teacher also tried to use it in order to damage Kassab's reputation. Other French institutions, such as the ones of the Jesuits, for example, were also very critical of the school, which, according to their report from the same year of 1925, practiced overt anti-French propaganda. This was probably not the only reason why the mandate authorities kept a critical eye on this school and even shut it down at times, but it was not able to stop the increasing popularity of the institution and its lasting influence of Lebanese young women. And the school's success was also obvious through the fact that many other parents wanted to offered their daughters an education, and more and more offered girls the possibility to obtain the baccalaureate, something this Kassab school had done in advance. Comparing could thus lead to restrictive methods like the closing down of a school, but also to the success and a model character of an institution. I'm now coming to my second part about the criticism of the French mandate and referring to other, especially the British mandate. After the first years of the mandate, the dissatisfaction of large parts of the population with the mandate regime in Syria, but also in Lebanon, increased. The protests of 1925 are a telling example. And in this context, advocates of independent Lebanon used the comparison with the French colonies on the one hand to criticize the intrusive behavior of the French mandate, as the letter of a Lebanese notable to a French socialist politician reveals, where he clearly said that many of the French mandate employed behaved like in a French colony. They also frequently referred to the British mandates in Palestine, who, as you know better than me, had a much more pragmatic approach to governing the mandate, and thus gave more autonomy to the local institutions, while the French had a very strict and very direct rule in Lebanon. Nonetheless, this did not necessarily lead to a reunion of Syrian and Lebanese with Palestinian or Iraqi nationalists, and many Lebanese decided to accept the mandate as a transitional period and rather also accepted a kind of cooperation with the French. This became evident through a growing enrollment of Muslim students in, for example, the schools of the French secular mission in Beirut. And in parallel to that, the Mandate authorities in Lebanon also started to have to pay more attention to Muslim students, which until then had not been in their focus, but they had really concentrated on Maronite Christians. And as I said, the French secular school of the Mission Laïque Française received more and more students from Muslim, Sunni, and Greek Orthodox family, hitherto rather critical of the French mandate. And one of the parents of this school was Mohammed Jamil Beyhoum, whom I mentioned at the beginning, who wrote his PhD thesis about comparing mandates in Syria and Iraq, and who thus shared also the idea of claiming a more important place for the Arabic language in the schools in Syria and Lebanon, because in the British mandates much more importance were given to this language than in Lebanon, and this changed in the mid-1920s when more emphasis was put on the Arabic language also in French schools. The French schools thus clearly felt this competition and this need to change, and invested into the teaching of Arabic and employed teachers of Arabic, and were also able to rise its number of students and also of female students. And in 1934, for example, an article in the Beiruti newspaper An-Nahar praised the girls' performances in both French and Arabic language at the school's celebration. Here you can see a celebration of this school, and this is the school where, for example, Salma Sayegh also taught Arabic and influenced different women, whom then became writers and feminist activists themselves. A field where both the interests of the parents and the competition between schools met was the field of sports. This is probably not unique to Lebanon, but more common. And while for many parents and their children, success in sports competitions between schools was a personal and social, but also political pride, French schools used this interest to compete either other French or other foreign schools. And here you can see two examples of, first, an individual success, exposed especially because it was a Muslim student in the French Catholic school in the 1930s or late 1920s, and also group movements which were proudly presented at competitions between different schools, mainly in Beirut. You can thus see that with the growing criticism of the mandate regime, Lebanese were able to change, to use their own tactics to change at least certain strategies of the French mandate authorities. I'm now coming to my third part, the attraction of American, German, and Italian schools at the end of the mandate. From the 1930s onward, a possible end of the French mandate in Lebanon came closer. The independence of Iraq in 1932 and other events put pressure on the government in Paris to concede more autonomy to the Lebanese, partly realized through the Franco-Lebanese Treaty of 1936. Lebanese students, their parents, and different intellectuals expressed their growing criticism of the French mandate, also through the choice of educational institutions and cultural influences. And now the Maronite Christians I had mentioned at the beginning became also much more critical of the French system. On the one hand, American schools received greater attention. In the mid-1930s, the French school of the American University of Beirut became very attractive, especially for Muslim families, because it was first less strict and less linked to the French mandate, but still offered a solid teaching in French and also in Arabic. In 1934, Khalil Taqi al-Din, hitherto teacher of Arabic at the Mission Laïque, became teacher of French and Arabic at the French section of the American University of Beirut, much to the disapproval of the Mission Laïque. In fact, at that time, the American University of Beirut was an institution not only frequented by students from different parts of the Arab world, but also where nationalist groups, although to a limited degree, were able to discuss and express themselves more openly. Among these nationalists was Antun Saadeh, the founder of the Syrian National Socialist Party, who was allowed to teach German at this school to earn his living. Indeed, in the 1930s, the German and also Italian culture found new interest in Lebanon and the region. A prominent example is the Syrian intellectual Sati al-Husri, who preferred the German romantics idea of a nation to the one put forward by British or French thinkers of that time. A certain interest by other Arab nationalists and intellectuals for the German culture was quickly remarked by the German fascist government in order to win Arab populations against the French and British governments, yet, as you know, they were only very partially successful. As Christoph Schumann and others have observed, the fascination of Saadeh and others for the German fascist movement was mainly reduced to its organizational capacities and much less to the content it spread. And in 1947, on his return from his first exile to Beirut, Saadeh clearly stated that neither Germany nor Italy never helped him in any difficult situation. The same is true for Italian fascist influences in Lebanon, when in 1938 the Italian representative of the Vatican replaced the French flag on some female monasteries by the Italian flag. The anti-mandate-oriented newspaper Al Nida criticized this act sharply, much to the satisfaction of the Jesuits in Beirut, who were satisfied because of their very pro-French attitude. Yet in the 1930s, even the French schools, which had hitherto always defended the French mandate, began to realize that Lebanese independence became a reality. The French Catholic schools, but also the ones of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, started to offer even more courses for learning Arabic and to address the question of the future of Lebanon. The Jesuit school in Beirut, for example, in the early 1940s, devoted one issue of its school journal to the question of professions for their students and thus for the country as a whole. So in this journal you can see different professions discussed, and among them the army as a profession, which was not valuated a lot because in the early 1940s the French army had been defeated by the British in Lebanon, so this wasn't really a success story. The professions of jurists, physicians and engineers received much more consideration. In order to pursue these studies, to have these professions, the majority of alumni of French schools went to the French Jesuit University Saint-Joseph in Beirut, and only a minority attended the American University of Beirut. So you can see also the continuity of these educational careers. Among the latter, those who had been educated in French schools, mainly those coming from the French Protestant and the French secular school, went to the American University of Beirut. To conclude, I hope that this contribution has shown that comparing systems was used by many different historical actors involved in the question of education in Mandate Lebanon. While the French Mandate authorities, through their juridical, financial, and political positions, were able to use the comparison for their own benefit of implementing their power in the said state, Lebanese students, their parents, and other public figures were nonetheless not powerless. Having at their disposal a large number of French, but also foreign schools, they used the comparison first in order to find the school that best suited their expectations in terms of training, but also, for example, for the education of girls, of security for the girls, and also, most importantly, social distinction. Second, they were also able to exert pressure on the schools in order to influence the latter's educational choices. Thus, the claim to Lebanese independence, which gained more and more parts of the population through the mandate period, was also translated into concrete practices in and by the schools. Of course, the influence of French and other foreign schools did not stop with the end of the French mandate in Lebanon. On the contrary, it continued a lot. But, however, some Lebanese intellectuals strengthened the value of national institutions. And I once again come back to Salma Sayegh, whom we have heard from in 1912, and who in 1949 published a book on certain aspects of humanism in Lebanon, where she lists a number of institutions she visited and thus gives an overview of all institutions doing either educational, charitable, or medical offering services. As in 1912 she had criticized her compatriots' blind appreciation of foreign schools, her book from 1949 showed mainly Lebanese works, among them the female renaissance of Beirut, Al-Nahda al-Nisaiya fi Beirut, of whom she was a member, as well as her pupil Nazira Zaineddin, whom she had taught at the Mission Laïque School, and whom she then invited to join this female committee. While in the little text about this association, she thanked the director of the French secular mission for having offered them a space for meeting, she also emphasized the women's desire to, I quote, revive the national industries in order to stop the flow of immigration. One can thus see that even after the French Mandate, comparing educational institutions remained an important instrument of social and political engagement in independent Lebanon. Thank you very much.